Exactly. Otherwise they fall over, because when you put them on their midfoot, like our slouches, I don't know if you've seen those, where like we'll get them on their midfoot. So like my cue there is stand in a split stance and then get your ribs to drive over your midfoot. So your ribs are over your midfoot now. And then when you relax your neck, you'll automatically feel more tension going through your calf, because we're taking away some of your strategies to hold your pressure. Then I'll get them to slouch the rib cage, and then even more pressure goes through their plantar flexors. And then by the time we get them to reach their fingers down to their toes, there's no option but to come back up through pushing through the midfoot.
That was Dave O'Sullivan, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Before we get to the show today, I wanted to mention a really cool item that is available now from our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, in their store. That item is Exogen Premium Wearable Resistance. Exogen is a series of tight-fitting sleeves along with uniquely shaped fusiform weights that strap directly onto those sleeves. So what I mean is you can have shin sleeves, arm sleeves, shorts, and a vest, and you can strap these uniquely fusiform shaped weights. They're light in nature, 100, 200 grams, that strap on in a way that allows you not only to resist movement very specifically, but also add fine-tuned elements of rotation to that resistance. So this is the next level of wearable resistance. You may have heard this from back long ago on the show, Hank Kreinhoff talking about it, to recently Chris Korfis, sprint coach, talking about it. This is the next level in premium wearable resistance. I've used it myself. I love it. I love not only the way it feels and the way you feel form and technique change. It's like combining technique with power. And so often we just think about weighted vests as just pure force, pure downward gravity loaded resistance. This is the ultimate combination of technique with power, and it shows up in things like Chris Korfis being able to take time off an athlete's 10-meter fly by putting the sleeves just on one side of the body, an ipsilateral resistance. We're using the body's own systems, fine-tuning it, and that's what this does. It allows you as the coach or an athlete to create, explore, and fine-tune the way that the resistance is rotationally impacting the body. This is next level stuff, and I know you'll love it. So you can check that out in the Simply Faster store. Head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com, and get your Exogen gear today. Hello and welcome to another show. Great to have you all here. So when it comes to injury prevention, one of the things I love about talking injury prevention is just the muscle patterning and kinetic chain patterning that comes out of it. Honestly, training athletes just to not get hurt was never truly exciting to me. I mean, I did appreciate and grow in my ability to help athletes have healthier seasons. And I felt like actually I've developed a really effective system at that. But what I really enjoy the most out of all this, I would say, in terms of just from a learning perspective, is just learning more about the body, learning more about what makes us tick and what patterns we're optimally supposed to use, and how so often we might be harming these patterns through things that we are doing in the gym too often or too intensely or too frequently. And so today we're going to have really a masterclass in not only really knee injury prevention, but foot and hip function and basic exercises that are going to absolutely force athletes into positions where they're maximizing their foot, their calf, their glute. And how do we build a program up from there? To guide us through this is Dave O'Sullivan. Dave is a chartered physio, and he's the founder of ProSport Academy. He's worked with elite level rugby for many years, and he now teaches his own approach through his ProSport Academy, as well as being in his private practice. You may have heard David Gray, back on his first appearance on this podcast, talk about how he mentored under Dave O'Sullivan and learned from him on things like delayed knee extension, and delayed knee extension being a really important way of recruiting the glutes and movements. And as I've talked with Dave and heard him on other podcasts, Dave is a bucket of information. He has synthesized so many great physical therapy and human performance systems out there into his own method. And Dave gets results all the way from square one, return to play, all the way up to getting athletes ready to step onto the pitch on a high performance level. We can learn so much from his knowledge. And on today's show, we're going to talk about bridges and split squat slouches on all forms. Basically, how do we train the foot from square one all the way up to more high performance methods? Tons of stuff in here on knee injury prevention, glutes, using drivers and advanced methods in return to play, and even when and when not to work the big toe in training. So consider this a foot to hip masterclass. Tons of awesome information in here. And one last thing is that some of these exercises, go check out the show notes on the justflysports.com website, and I'll have some video links to some of these exercises that Dave is describing within the body of the podcast. All right, let's get on to it. Episode 247 with Dave O'Sullivan. Dave, so, I'm sure other countries or here in the United States, there's probably a little bit of sadness of not being able to, fully celebrate St. Patrick's Day and give it its due. But I'm sure in Ireland, it's probably even worse. So how are you guys managing St. Patrick's Day over there right now?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm in England at the moment, but I'd usually be down the Irish Centre, probably 6 to 8 pints deep by now. So as I said, first Patrick's Day, my staff have worked in a long time, so it's a bit different. I know my dad's watching Cheltenham, the horse racing today. That's a big St. Patrick's Day event in Ireland, so he's having a bottle of beer. So I might have a bottle after this maybe, but it's very, very different.
Yeah, be a little weird. I'm just kidding. I've never been to Ireland. It's on the to-do list, but it's definitely interesting to think about. One thing I wanted to kick this off, and thinking about your background, it strikes me as similar to mine, just like in just reaching out to a lot of different people and systems and trying to make it your own. But I'm curious the systems that have influenced you the most in your career, and maybe just get quickly into a little bit of your background as well and where you've been, and then some of the main learning points along the way.
Yeah, so I'm a physiotherapist by profession, I suppose, if you want to call it that. I kind of finished university, went straight into professional sport. So kind of the done thing in the UK is like, go into the national healthcare setting and do your rotations. But I always had a passion for kind of sports and sports injuries. So went straight into Rugby League, Rugby Union, working 13 years now in that really. So, and then alongside that, have my own private practice in Huddersfield in the UK. So yeah, I suppose my story, I don't know if I've told it a few times, is I got frustrated, especially when I moved back to Ireland to work with Munster Rugby, which is my big rugby club, and two guys retired on my watch there, and two very which I think you might touch on, two very different reasons. One was like blatant like pathology, like I won't say the joy. They'd be pretty high profile, but one like a lot of pathology. Then the other was more, probably just mindset, if I'm being brutally honest. And so they were two very different injuries. And that's when I had enough really. I was like, geez, I thought I was a lot better than I was. And I realized that actually I'm not as good as I think I am, being brutally honest. So then, I just went on this kind of courses merry-go-round. And then, I spent a fortune on courses. I was obsessed, like even books and stuff like that. I've got thousands of books, and it kind of all came to a standstill with me then when, just like my big pet hate is like short-term changes where you can create this like change in range of motion, or you can do something, but 10 minutes later they walk out the door and they're back to square one again. So that really frustrates me in sport, because there's nowhere to hide in sport. Like the guys are with you 24/7 basically. So I learned quickly not to get too impressed with that stuff. So just kind of when I gave up course hopping, I just said, look, I don't think there's anything else there certainly that that I'm missing, and I kind of gave myself permission just to take the best bits of various courses and I suppose put it more into a structure. So there's a guy, I don't know if you've come across him, he's called Louis Gifford. He's a physio in the UK. He's deceased now, bless him, but I read his books, Aches and Pains, and he talked a lot about creative exposure, and that's when I was like, that's what I'm missing. That's why stuff's coming back again, because it's not necessarily the exercise or the hands-on treatment was the right or the wrong exercise choice. It's just they needed a bit more high-level load tolerance to keep these changes. Because when they go into the real world, like stress and movement, and there's so much stimulus going into the nervous system, it's very, very different to being in the physio room and you're doing 3 sets of 10, or you're doing a nice breathing exercise. It's very, very different. So that's when then I started to look at all the stuff I'd done. And to be honest, it just all kind of clicked into place for me, really. Was, I'd done a lot of different stuff. Like FMS would have like influenced my approach, Gray Cook, like back in the day, and Gary Gray in America, he was massive with 3D movement. And then like I've done Gary Ward's course as well. PRI then came along, and all of this stuff, just putting it all together. And then, I started to get into Franz Bosch's stuff, and that stuff really resonated with me. And then the big defining point for me really was when I came across the motor adaptations to stress literature. So that was more like, what happens when we have pain and how the body responds. And I could really resonate with that, because I could see the stuff happening in front of my eyes, where a guy comes in and they don't have pain, but they have a sensation that's uncomfortable, and it's causing them to affect either their performance, or it's enough for them to come and ask for help, but it's not quite pain, if that makes sense. And I'm seeing this day and day out in rugby. And when I started to understand that stuff, that's when then I started to kind of really put the pieces of the puzzle together and really appreciate previous injuries and how adaptations can happen because of those injuries. And then, as I said, I just kind of put it all into a structure really, and brought it, back to the Franz Bosch. Definitely helped me bring it back to physiological principles. We're looking at how muscles, like physiological properties of muscles, and then looking at all of that stuff. And I always felt with Franz's stuff, and I've said it to him, is, when I questioned him about pain, he'll openly admit he doesn't know that much about that stuff. It's more performance. So that's when I said, okay, I need to create some stuff that ultimately will bridge the gap from his stuff, which is very high level stuff, to the guy that's injured, and ultimately get him ready to that kind of stuff. So that's when I just started, when I looked at like principles of movement and stuff like that, kind of you look at it, and my exercise design changed slightly. And it wasn't a whole throw out everything that I was doing. Like, for instance, the midfoot stuff, I was just like, well, instead of bridging through the heel, bridge through the midfoot. It was subtle changes, but they were making big differences. And once I started to understand why we were doing that stuff, then that gives me a lot of clarity in tweaking stuff and in progressing stuff. And I think that was the kind of key thing really, was the long lasting changes, and just putting it into a system really, if you want to call it that. Sorry, I've blabbered on there.
No, it's good. It's nice to know where you've been, and obviously you've learned from so many people that I think it takes some due justice to actually explain where you've been. And honestly, I feel like this whole podcast, I could say, okay, tell me the main things you're doing with, Gary Gray and Gary Ward and PR. I mean, we could do a whole show on that. So I hope to hear that woven in throughout, because I'm familiar, and I know a lot of listeners are familiar with those systems as well, or at least a few of them, I'm sure. And so I'm curious I like to tend to think about things in the 80-20 principle, the 20% of what that system does. I mean, not always, but I think generally there's some big rocks in any system that's going to give you quite a bit of result. And that's the way I've kind of tried to tend to think of it, because otherwise I just don't have enough time in the day to study everything. I don't think any of us do. And so I'd like to, I guess, something you had said that I was thinking of was, you had this point where you just weren't happy with, where you were at. And you mentioned that a big thing was kind of that bridge between the therapy and then the full return to play. So like almost that performance-based rehab and those types of things. So I'd like to get into, I guess, maybe like the spectrum of how you approach things. I think a lot of people are familiar with like low-level therapy drills, but I'm really interested in that bridge. And even one thing, and maybe we can start about talk with the foot, because that's always, that's in vogue. It's always fun to talk about. I enjoy learning about it. You said you had gotten massive changes, changing from a heel pressure to a midfoot pressure. So maybe we can start talking about key things that you want to have happen in the foot, and how that shifts from, I just hurt myself, I have very low capabilities, to, okay, I'm running again, to now I need to change directions explosively. Again, maybe this could be the whole show, and if that's all we talk about, that's fine. But give me an overview of how you approach the foot from hurt all the way up to high performance.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm the stuff I do, I still don't know how to explain this well. I'm specific in the directions that I want to put load through. And that's where you'll really see Gary Gray's stuff. Like, if I want to put more load through the lateral hip, I'll make a variation like that. But in terms of what I'm trying to do, it's very non-specific in terms of, I just want to put load on these tissues, and I want to let the system self-organize. So I probably, and that's a good point in terms of the courses and stuff. Like, I've taken all these courses, and I've got the utmost respect for a lot of these people. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of maybe what they're saying. And I think that's okay. But like, I'm looking at stuff, and when I go to a course, I go, okay, I don't really agree with that, but why is he getting those results? And that's my mindset when I go into a course. Like, I'll be brutally honest with you. So, and I think too many therapists, they kind of, as you kind of alluded, you hear a word that you don't like, and you throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I'd like to think I'm open-minded, and I go, okay, this stuff, there's something in this, and then when I bring it back to the principles and try to make sense of stuff, I think that's where I get my big breakthroughs, is looking at why this stuff maybe is helping. So, sorry, with the off tangent there. So when I design a rehab program, I look at the end in mind, and then I reverse engineer it basically. So when we look at a top end speed, what's happening there, what qualities do we need, what muscles need to be able to develop high levels of tension and tolerate load. That's that's probably the biggest question I need to answer. And if it's a straight line kind of sport, or if it's a change of direction, then that's obviously gonna change things a little bit. So, when that foot hits the floor, there's some really good studies coming out in the last couple of years. And I got this wrong. I thought it was all about the hamstrings. It's not. Is the soleus is the king. And I got this wrong. I thought it was the hamstrings for years. And it was like in the last year, I've only started to realize that it's actually soleus is that, I know you wanted to talk about like the one muscle for knee pain. That's it. And because that needs to take between 6 and 8 times the body weight. So getting the weight off the heel onto the midfoot, you're just getting low tolerance through soleus. That to me is one of the big reasons why we're getting so much success with these exercises. So, there's a Dorn study, 2012, which is kind of going around Twitter, and it takes between 6 and 8 times the body weight. And then there's a guy, and I don't want to mess up now. I'm shocking for remembering names, but I think it's Manier et al. There's like a David Opar. They've done these couple of studies that show that soleus, the first 25% of stance, your soleus is basically managing, your tibia. It's pulling your tibia posteriorly, while the quad or the vastus, and the gastro are pulling it anteriorly. So there's that massive balance there that needs to happen between soleus and vasti and gastro for the first 25%. So, as that foot hits the floor, that's where it gets really interesting to me, is because the brain knows, the nervous system knows, and if it doesn't want to put load through a tissue, how your foot hits the floor, to me, in my opinion anyway, your brain's going to find a way to avoid loading it, which kind of goes back to the motor adaptations literature. So that was interesting to me. So then when we put them on their midfoot and we get that soleus working well, and I, like up to probably a year ago, I thought it was a lot of what I was doing was the hamstring stuff. But once we got that going, things started to change, and their low backs relaxed, we've got more ribcage mobility and all that stuff. So that was interesting to me. So then I was looking at sprinters and looking at, what's happening at the knee, the function of the hamstring and soleus. And then starting to see actually a lot of this stuff, it's about that co-contraction with the knee, and that kind of fitted into the time I was with Bosch and looking at co-contractions. And so then I just started to reverse engineer a lot of the drills into that slow movement at the start, but building high levels of tension. And I think that's the key thing, is when I say it's very non-specific, what I do is I just put them into a position and I just go to them, deal with that. And that's where we can bring the breathing stuff in with. And it's like develop high levels of tension, and you'll see them shaking. Their nervous system will be going crazy, but they'll figure it out because we're resilient people. And, that's where you'll see them. They'll do everything in their power to get their load off that midfoot. They'll go back on their heel. They'll snap their knee back. They'll do anything possibly to get load off that midfoot. But once we keep it on that, then we started to get real good results. And then the biggest thing, which is the step before running or before return to play, which I think people don't do enough of, is that leaping and that hopping. And to get, I was coaching, athletes yesterday coming back from like just knocks over the weekend, and we're just preparing them to train. And that awareness of landing on that midfoot and feeling in a strong position, because it's all about the next step when we do these leaps, isn't it? It's, getting your foot in a good position to reproduce force into the floor, either go forward, back, sideways. We just want movement options. But that's an awareness to me that a lot of these athletes, they skip the midfoot. So like if you have ankle issues, like, and you get a pinch in your ankle when you do need to wall test, you're probably going to skip the midfoot. You're going to go straight onto your toes. Because if you go straight onto your toes, your heel's going to lift. You're not going to have to pinch that ankle or something like that. So I think athletes, they stay on their heels or they stay on their toes, they miss that midfoot. So giving them that awareness of the midfoot, and when I reflect now why our stuff works so well, I think is we're giving them massive awareness back, and we're showing the nervous system that it's safe to tolerate load through the midfoot again. So when they get to the high level hopping, they have it and they've got that awareness, and then they can find it. And then that's so important then, I think, for deceleration and change of direction. And most of the athletes that come to us, that kind of, they've done all the strengthening and they've been with great therapists. A lot of it's the coordination or the ability to build tension as opposed to just the strength. So I kind of see this stuff as the step before strength. I still think strength's very important, but I think it's the ability to build tension and the nervous system happy to build tension. That has to come before you put load on them, because you'll find a way to get it to avoid loading certain tissues. And I've seen that time and time again.
Yeah, I love that. And what I've noticed, athletes like with knee pain, and It's funny I'm like, do I pronounce soleus wrong, or is this just the American pronunciation?
That's probably me. I get my words mixed up all the time, so it's a good chance it's me.
I have no idea, to be honest. I know how it's spelled, and I just say it how I think it's spelled. But for people listening, it's the flatter muscle, the flatter, deeper calf muscle compared to the diamond, bodybuilder gastrocnemius muscle. But it makes sense to me what you're saying with that, because I actually hadn't heard that before until you mentioned it on Robbie's podcast, with that being like the linchpin. And to me, it's almost, I'd be curious what you think about this, is like a chicken or the egg scenario. I notice athletes who tend to have a lot of lower body dysfunction and knee pain, if I put them in a split squat, for example, and I watch their back foot mechanics, they usually go into a lot of dorsiflexion, and they can't really control. It's like the soleus, I guess you could say, isn't really controlling that back foot. Like when they drop into the bottom of a split squat, I like to see the heel come up as the knee comes down. And I'll notice athletes who tend to have dysfunction, their heel will just sit back and they'll go into extreme dorsiflexion. There's just nothing really neurologically happening there. And I do a lot of work too in running with like trying to get the arches of the foot to form, and then as the shins going forward, working the heel up and working the arch. But I think do you think it's like a chicken or the egg thing, in the sense of the soleus maybe shuts off over time because the mechanics just aren't good. The athlete has poor foot sensation and just lets the heel drop and the knee just goes over. And I don't know, like, how do you think athletes get to that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the interesting thing about the midfoot and the soleus is the soleus has to work with pretty much every other muscle in the lower limb. So I think, personally, this is my opinion, but I think what happens is, if you might have had an MCL injury and your brain might want to load that adductor and that medial hamstring. So when you push through the midfoot, your soleus, when that loads, it's also going to load the distal hamstring. So by not loading the soleus, you don't also load the hamstring. So you might end up, that might be somebody that you might end up, putting more pressure either side, so that you kind of avoid loading that. So I think the soleus is the thing. Kind of, I know Gary Gray talked about the knee being stuck between the hip and the ankle. I think the soleus is the thing stuck between the foot and the rest of the limb. So for one person, they might want to load their big toe because it's going to put load through their peroneals, which is an all ankle sprain, versus someone else who doesn't want to load their fifth metatarsal because it's going to load their tib post or whatever. So, I think that is my gut feeling why that this common kind of reaction happens, where people don't have good intention through their soleus.
Gotcha. And
so I think it's the next step, basically, of what it's protecting up the chin, and that goes kind of back to the previous injuries, I think.
Gotcha. And I imagine that's where maybe Gary Ward's stuff comes in, with filling space with wedges, and like if someone needs pressure on one part or the other.
Yeah, definitely 100%. And I think, like, my goal is, I want the whole foot to do its job. So like my end goal is, when you squat and you come down into hip flexion, I want the weight to come to the heel. And when you come up out of hip flexion and you go into hip extension, I want the weight to go to the foot, midfoot, forefoot. So I want the full foot to do its job, but majority of the rehab in the early stages, we have to bias the midfoot, because that's the bit usually that the nervous system is, excuse me, I don't know if I'm allowed swearing this, but it's scared shitless to put load through it. So I'm kind of evil in that way. I'll just put them into a position and go, here, take that load, figure it out. And I'm lazy. Like I'll literally, like 2-3 cues and just let them there, and they figure it out. Otherwise they're going to fall over. And I think that's where I can't say with confidence I know what's going on a lot of the time, but it's just like that. When I keep it that simple, I don't tend to get as distracted.
I like what you were saying just like a few minutes ago. You put an athlete basically in a position and let them figure it out. It's almost like put them in a position where they have to figure it out. I'm assuming that's kind of what you're going at.
Exactly. Otherwise they fall over, because when you put them on their midfoot, like our slouches, I don't know if you've seen those, where like we'll get them on their midfoot. So like my cue there is stand in a split stance and then get your ribs to drive over your midfoot. So your ribs are over your midfoot now. And then when you relax your neck, you'll automatically feel more tension going through your calf, because we're taking away some of your strategies to hold your pressure. Then I'll get them to slouch the rib cage, and then even more pressure goes through their plantar flexors. And then by the time we get them to reach their fingers down to their toes, there's no option but to come back up through pushing through the midfoot. And that's, I saw that variation of exercise with Peter O'Sullivan. He's a therapist in Australia. I'm not sure if you're aware of him. And he was using something similar, like a bilateral version of that, with a back pain patient with back pain for 20 years. And he's on stage doing all this stuff. And I know there's kind of, there's expectations and all that stuff with it as well. But like, to me, I'm looking at what he's doing and I'm like, people were saying it's like, the bio, the psychosocial, all of this stuff. I'm looking at co-contractions, I'm looking at ribcage depression. I'm like, just why is this helping? And I'm seeing then that was like clicking into place. Yeah, he's co-contracting at the knee, he's mobilizing the ribcage, he's stretching the diaphragm, he's getting them to breathe, and starting to put all the pieces together. So then what I did after that course, I just made a split squat variation of that. And that's how the slouch was born, basically, the kind of slouch that we use that I teach in the mentorship. So get them on their midfoot and then just relax their neck, relax their back. And it just started working great with lower limb injuries because it's getting everything to do its job. And as you come back up from the slouch, the beauty of it is, unless you extend your neck and your back, you have to use your glute there to come back up and hip extend. So it kind of goes back to keeping things simple, where you give them no choice but to use the muscles, otherwise they're going to cheat.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, the slouch. David Gray showed me it, I think, in one of our very first Skype conversations a few years ago. And the way I think about it, and I want to get into like maybe the more specifics of how do you coach the midfoot. I totally agree with you. I see an athletes who do have like dysfunctional knee type issues. It's like it's heel and then it's stay supinated and get into the toes, basically, seems to be their strategy so often, where they don't, pronate or get into the midfoot. So I'd love to go over some strategies.
Yeah, I'll give you videos, mate. If you want to put videos on the show notes or whatever, I can give you some videos as well. That's no problem.
All right, we'll have them on the show notes. So if you're listening, check out the main page.
Yeah, it's very hard to describe.
But yeah, I think I might be able to. The way I perceive it, and just because I do think this principle fits. We've done a lot of shows on this podcast series of like an impingement based strategy of bilateral squatting, for example, where someone sticks their chest out and butt back, and their ribs are forward and they have a compression in the low lumbar spine, and that's their strategy. And I look at the slouch, at least if I'm thinking of it, as like, okay, now we're in a split, like a quarter split or a half split stance, and instead of an impingement, like you're going the other way, like a Jefferson curl. And it's almost like all these muscles that were like kind of inactive because you were using more of a bone structure, a lumbar strategy, are now active because you kind of like took the lumbar out of it, I guess, if that makes sense a little bit.
100%. Yeah. That's all we're doing. And professional athletes that I work with day in, day out, they like really struggle with that stuff just as much as the non-sporting patient. And that's the beauty of this stuff is I very much see that as a nervous system exercise. And I think the nice thing about that is, as you said, when you take the lumbar spine out of it, there's nowhere to hide for the lower leg, and it has to build a lot of tension, so we can put, a lot of load through these tissues without weight. And it's so easy to do, which is why, I really like them.
Yeah, I know that just the bilateral Jefferson curl, like just standing on a bench and rounding your back with a lighter weight, basically going the opposite of what you typically lift, is becoming more popular for just kind of, I don't like to say bulletproofing. I don't really like that term because it kind of, I don't know, maybe it disrespects the working the body mechanically. You know what I'm saying? I think with the Jefferson curl, I think probably the big difference between the slouches and the Jefferson curl would probably more be the knee going forwards. Yeah.
So I'd be very much keeping the knee forward to force the soleus to take a lot of load. So it wouldn't be just, trying to, I think if you kept the knee straight, that's going to make it harder to get onto the midfoot, so that a lot of them will be on their heels, and then you're probably putting a bit more eccentrics through the lower back. So yeah, it's a really good question. What I'm trying to do with the slouches is get the knees forward over the midfoot, and by relaxing the back, I don't want an eccentric contraction, like a true eccentric contraction, if you know what I mean, where the intent is to try to contract. I want the back, as you said, to relax, as opposed to try to resist extension. Does that kind of make sense, what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
So for me, and that's a really good point, is like it's so much harder to relax than it is to contract, especially with people with persistent pain. And that's the key of it. And that's, I think, where the neurology of this stuff comes in. It's putting people in positions where you can actually show their nervous system how to relax for the first time and relax their back. But with the slouches, it's the more we put their knees over their toes, and once their weight's on their midfoot, all the pressure and all the load tolerance goes on their legs. So for the first time, their back can actually relax. And I've got a phrase, I don't know if I made this up, I probably could have robbed it, so apologies if I robbed it. But the phrase I use is, if you improve co-contractions peripherally, you'll decrease co-contractions centrally. So a lot of our like approach in physio is like try to get rid of, like with persistent pain, is try to get rid of these core contractions of rigidity.
Yeah.
Like a lot of back pain patients are moving rigid. But I find when we improve the core contractions in the peripheral limbs, the rib cage, it just melts. Basically, the mobility comes back, and you can access ranges that you weren't able to access previously.
I started my career in strength and conditioning, having a very manufactured approach to training. You're going to do this many sets and reps of this exercise. You're going to do it like this. You're going to do this movement prep first and everything with that. And over 8 years of time as a full-time strength coach, I slowly shifted into a more athlete-centered organic approach where athletes had more options on how to do things. They could express themselves. They could move with flow. We did more gymnastics. We did more games. We did more organic learning. I will never turn back on that. Along the same lines, I've gotten into a more organic approach of supplementation, moving away from caffeine-heavy pre-workouts into herbs such as shilajit, which you may have heard mentioned by guests on this show in the past as being awesome for strength and vitality. That's why I'm proud to partner with two-time previous guest on this show, Logan Christopher, and his company, Lost Empire Herbs. If you want to check out some of the herbs that have led me into becoming a stronger and more vital human being, ones that I use personally, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. You can get 15% off your order there, as well as get a 365-day money-back guarantee. Again, to get 15% off your order with Lost Empire Herbs and see my top recommended herbs that I use personally, head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. All right, let's get on back to the show. I like that you said, getting rid of the I just think of it, and I guess the way I resonate with it is you're just putting less noise in the system. And I guess if you're listening to this, check the videos out. But the best way I can describe it maybe is think about, and I'm glad you mentioned like the knees over toes. I know that thankfully is becoming a paradigm that's becoming much more accepted. And I like also, like you're saying, like when the knee goes over the toe, now it's a position that the body has to deal with. And we can open up the foot to have to do more things. So for people listening, like if people are familiar with like Ben Patrick's ATG split squat, where the front knees going over, maybe think of like a halfway down version of that combined with a little bit of a Jefferson curl where the knee stays forward. And maybe that's the best way I can describe it. But the key, and the thing I always notice, ever since David showed me this, I've had a lot of my clients and athletes do it. And I always notice, speaking of not being able to relax, is like the people who struggle, like they get to the bottom, they slouch over the split stance front knee that's forward, and then they go back up. And the people who can't relax like to straighten that knee out. They're in like straighten back out the knee mode. They want to straighten the knee out before the hip can do its job. So that's another reason I really like that movement. Versus like just doing, I guess you could just say, oh, well, why don't you just go do bent knee calf raises? Like that'll strengthen the soleus, but that doesn't reduce the noise anywhere else. I guess you could say it's less coordinated.
Yeah, 100%. The intent, and it's all coordination to me, this stuff, which is why it kind of fits in with Bosch's stuff. And because you'll get them to change. And this is kind of, I suppose, where the system's going to be good. So like for me, if that was happening, like what I teach my mentorship, if that was happening in standing, then we'd regress them to lying on their back. So if they're in standing, if their knee is kicking back, that to me means the hamstring and the soleus can't tolerate load well. So what we would do then is, I don't know if you've seen the midfoot bridge test that we use. So it's like you lie on the back and you just get the weight through the midfoot and you just do a little bridge. So like the bum's just like literally an inch off the floor. And what I'd expect to find with somebody like that with a knee kickback is that their hamstring or their soleus will probably cramp. Because again, that to me is some protective strategy there where they're not happy to tolerate load. So that's where then we would probably use some of the regressions, clean that up. And then once we have high levels of load tolerance through the hamstring and soleus, then get them in standing and do the slouch again. Because like it's really interesting because if you've somebody, from my experience, doing that and the knees kick back, you can coach them all day long and they're trying, but they'll just kick back again because they don't know how to access it. So and Dave Gray's done some lovely variations of that stuff as well. He'll show like all variations on his Instagram as well of like the midfoot bridges on foam rollers and stuff like that. And really what that's doing is you're tolerating a shitload of soleus, a shitload of hamstring to delay knee extension. So do some of that and then get back up into standing and you'll see a completely different exercise. And that's kind of where the system fits in, where, if they're struggling in standing there, let's get them back. Let's do the stuff on their back, but then let's get them back up to standing as soon as possible. Because I think that's my other pet hate or pet peeve at the moment is I think a lot of athletes are doing too much on their backs. I think once they have the ability to stand and
Yes.
get them up into the hop and stuff, that's where we need to be spending our time, because that's where I still make mistakes today. I still flare athletes up at this level, but you're never going to flare an athlete up on their back. But if you put an athlete back too quickly and they haven't earned the right to progress through the high level rehab with the hops and create high rates of force development and high speeds of movement, if you don't do that and you put them back running, to me, you're just guessing basically that they're ready to run again. So I think for me, once they have that co-contraction of the knee, get them in standing and spend a lot of time feeling that awareness, because when you do leaps and hops, a lot of that's pre-tension. That, as we said there, the nervous system is deciding how much pre-tension you're going to put as that foot hits the floor. So that's the bit I think we need to spend a lot more time with a rehab, and that's where we can build that resilience and that confidence with athletes. And I think really that's where the confidence is built. It's not built on your back.
I couldn't agree more. It makes me think about, I got a DC current stim machine from Dr. Tommy John, who's been on this podcast a few times, and he is adamant about doing the stim standing up, like not sitting down, not being treated on a table. Like he wants it to be standing, and the DC current's active, so you can like move with it, but he's very adamant about standing. And so because I think people will see exercises and just say, oh, well, here's an exercise, everyone should be doing this. And yeah, I mean, on the basic level, sure. And everyone should have competency, but then as soon as you're good, like let's get to a standing position. The way I think of it too, I'm glad you mentioned the people who want to extend the knee early. And I think a version of that other people might be familiar with, especially like performance end coaches. And I think Kyle Dobbs talked about this a little while ago on the show, but like in an Olympic lift, once the bar passes the knees, you actually need to delay the knee extension a little bit. You need to, it's almost like you're doing that deadlift-ish movement off the floor. And then once the bar passes the knees, you don't just extend your knees right away and supinate the foot. You have to let the bar come up into the thighs a little bit where the glutes are working, but I guess the legs still have the co-contractions where the knee isn't extending. Like a lot of CrossFit coaches, they'll say, be patient, be patient. But I find that explosive athletes, I can get them to, but it's not natural. And now that I think about it, it would be good to like before we do that, and I'm trying to coach them to do it, we need to get competencies at these single leg versions with a slouched torso or lying on their back. And the foot bridge too, I was going to say that one with the foam roller kills me, where I like am lying on my back and the ball of my foot's on a foam roller. Like I consider myself to have a good posterior chain. Like I can do bounds and any sprint variation, you name it. And I don't get hamstring pulls, but that thing, man, like that one kills me for some reason. I've always struggled with that version with the foot on the foam roller and the ball of the foot there for whatever reason.
It's interesting, is it? Because that's the ideal length tension relationship that our hamstrings and our soleus to a point needs to work at. And most people, when we do exercise, especially on their back, they're too in a range. And I remember pulling the heel close to the bum to isolate the glutes, like back in the day. Mm-hmm. And it's like, actually the most exercise we need to be out of range. And like, I read that blog a few years ago, the glute's only as good as the hamstring and the gastro allows it to be, which it should be now, the hamstring and soleus. Looking back, it should be that instead of gastro. But the length tension relationship there of muscles is so important, because they can only produce certain amount of force over certain lengths and speed of movement. So I think what we're doing there with that outer range, it's and that's going to be the one that's going to be the trickiest. Hamstrings as well, like your central tendon tears with hamstrings, like they're always the trickiest to get back. And that's the kind of ranges where you're tolerating a lot of tension, but you're transferring a lot of energy through the hamstring into the hip. And I think that's why that's a different feeling as well to kind of what your traditional strength exercises. And that's where Bosch's stuff's great, is that energy, that transfer of energy as well. Like that, I think that's what we're feeling personally.
Yeah, tell me a little bit, and maybe this fits with some of the shifts that you've had, and this would be a good one just for, I think, everybody, because this was a shift for me when David taught me this, was the idea of when a lot of us think about glutes and hip extension, we think about just lying on our back and doing like a single leg glute bridge, just lift the butt all the way off the floor, and you aren't really necessarily thinking about the foot. And I know your version is much different than that, but as I've done it, it's way more effective. I mean, I just feel my feet, I feel everything so much more effectively. So could you explain how you like went from kind of maybe more of and you said you had the heel close to the butt. So tell me about how that things change once the heel gets away and some of the pressures when someone's like in a lying on their back, single leg bridge situation.
Yeah, so it just didn't make sense to me. So like when I was kind of looking at like, because PRI is like a concentric gait and Gary Ward's like an eccentric gait, and you're looking at that and you're kind of looking at their stuff, comparing them to, and there's differences and stuff like that. And then you start looking at Bosch's stuff and the soleus stuff starts to come in a little bit. It didn't make sense to me why we when it kind of looking at the muscle architecture and stuff, that why we are pushing through the heel. So I got really interested first, and as I said, I was wrong because it's actually soleus is the king now. I got really interested in the distal hamstrings because when I started to look at the muscle architecture, I noticed like the semitendinosus, and it was like, right, a lot of people knee pain, and when I started to understand tendons, and tendons are designed to transfer energy, and started to look at that, I was like, geez, like look at these medial hamstrings, like there's something in them. And then when that knee goes into valgus, that's where we really need those medial hamstrings and medial gastro. So I think it was that point where I started to get really interested in the distal hamstrings. So I was using the midfoot stuff to really get them, because it didn't make sense that if I was pushing through the heel, I'd be getting, in my head, I was thinking more proximal hamstrings. So getting the midfoot really got the distal, and then everyone started feeling that. And the interesting thing about the glute stuff is you're going to pick up, like you alluded to there, when you do a midfoot bridge, you're going to pick up a lot of tension because it's novel. But when you get used to that, you'll really feel your glute. But nothing's really changed. It's just your brain isn't picking up this. God, this is a lot of tension through my hammy. I get this all the time with athletes. Is the first few days it's like, Jesus, my hamstring's working here, and then they won't feel their hamstring because their hamstring's working isometrically, and then they feel, yeah, I can really feel my glute now. But they felt the glute was the same prior to this. It's just their brain was picking up that noise, as you say. Which is a good term. So I think with the midfoot stuff, I was trying to get more medial hamstring. That was kind of when I started to change it then. Because when when you push through your heel on a sit to stand, even if you sat here 90-90 and you push through your heel, you're not going to feel any medial hamstring. So that catastrophe behind your knee, you push through your midfoot, you're going to get that thing starting to engage a little bit more then when you're going to do a sit to stand. So I think that's where it all came from when I was trying to get more distal hamstring. But I was actually, looking back, I was getting a lot of soleus. But I thought it was all the medial hamstring at the time.
Yeah, so what you're saying is as soon as you went from basically that single leg on your back, glute bridge, and as soon as you're starting to go from the heel to the ball of the foot, and you're probably like straightening the leg a little bit more too, like lengthening the leg a little bit more, now it's going to go, instead of hamstrings near the hip, it's going to hamstrings close to the insertion of the knee.
And that reminds me. It was all when I started to look at like the physiological properties of muscles, length tension relationships, and started to really bring it back to the principles. That's when I started to look at, because I was looking at the hamstrings, I was looking at the muscles in a completely different track. I've actually got I've got an Atlas color of anatomy. I can't remember the author, but I bought that book and I was just looking at, like, I was obsessed with the muscles and how the angles they were attaching into the tendons and all this stuff. So like the peroneals going in at that 45-degree angle. And I was starting to study all that stuff. And then I was starting, like, the medial hamstrings, I remember they really caught my eye. And then I think it just stemmed from there, really,
Yeah. So with the coaching cues, then, because you've talked about the midfoot a lot, but we haven't talked about like the cueing, because I feel like that was really effective when David was taking me through it. It just brought a totally different feel. But like, I think you use like squished and orange, or can you tell me about how do you cue an athlete to push through the midfoot, and then what's that doing? What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I robbed that from Colin Griffin. I don't know if you know him. He's like a running S&C coach in Santry in Dublin in Ireland. He was on a podcast with me years ago, and he was telling me, he was athletes when they're running, they were getting them to squash oranges. So that was kind of the cue I used. That seemed to work really well, and I just stuck with it. Now, so this is kind of where it gets interesting with kind of like top down and bottom up cues. Like, that's a real big area of interest for me. So when we tell athletes to push through the midfoot or squash an orange, or you could like look at Nick Winkelman's kind of cues of push the ground away or whatever you're using. Those top down cues are good, but what we want ideally is we want bottom up, where we don't have to cue them.
Yes.
So I think they're really good cues at the start, but in the latter half of the rehab, I don't want to be cueing them to squash oranges. So that's kind of it's an intermediate step where it's like, give them absolute no choice but to build tension, and then let's build some extra tension by squashing an orange with intent. So that's the cue that I find works well. And we've actually had a patient bring an orange into one of my physios recently. So we get this all the time where she actually brought her physical orange in because we just say that cue. So I have to give Colin Griffin credit for that years ago. But I probably disagree, or I wouldn't tell an athlete. So like he told me he used it with squash and oranges running. I wouldn't tell an athlete to do that running now, if I'm being completely honest, because I want them by that stage of the rehab program, I want them just to be focused on movement. I don't want them to be thinking with using top-down cues, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I actually have a couple of thoughts there. I feel like I should write it down because I tend to get lost, but I don't think I can juggle the balls in the air of writing these down and asking you. So hopefully I'll keep it together. But I guess the first thing I was thinking about was you mentioned Nick Winkelman, and I was going to mention something in that Language of Coaching book that he wrote, which was excellent on, it's almost like the only place internal cues are really good is it's almost when you need the muscle, when you need to get that muscle dialed in. And he talked about like doing an arm curl. And there was a study where people did bicep curls with internal cues. And I think people just did them. And the people who had the internal cue of squeeze the bicep at the top, actually, I think ended up getting a little bit more size on their bicep muscle or something like that. I don't know if their strength, I don't think they could curl any more weight, but that bicep got bigger. And ever since I read that, actually, I don't do arm. I mean, if people watch my like Instagram stuff, I'm pretty functional. Like I'm doing like breakdance stuff or jumping or sprinting or whatever. But I don't know. Last time I did my arm curls, though, I'm like, okay, my forearms are huge from like rock climbing and all these things, and I have a ton of tension in my neck. So it's like, well, I need to reduce that noise, and I need to use really lightweight, and I need to use an internal cue here because. I mean, it's just, any bodybuilder listening to this show, I don't think there's many, but they would probably laugh at me. It's intuitive. Of course, that's what you need to do, right? So it almost strikes me that with something like the foot, if you have dysfunctional level muscle, just the muscles aren't going in, you need to reduce noise. Like that's where those internal cues, so Squish the Orange is good. And then as you move from, one of the things I did a lot of studying and mentoring under the biomechanics and running coach Darian Barr back when I was in California. And one of the last year I was there, he said something I really liked, and it was the idea that I was always trying to make sense of pronation and supination in terms of like basic gait versus actually sprinting. And Adarian had given up on really, like he said, I've given up on pronation and supination in context of sprinting because he's like, at that point, it's just circles, and you're not really going through the full range. You're just managing forces. And so I think of it like that a little bit, like it's almost like the cues and actually working pronation, supination gives you the basic hardware and the basic stuff to work with. But then when you're actually running, like, and David had said this, I think on my podcast, I'm not sure, like he would get people who were a train wreck in actual standing tests, but then they'd actually walk or run and they could like get it together a little bit, organize it. So I'm kind of like blabbering out, but I get it because I wouldn't use that cue either in running. Like you had mentioned, I wouldn't, like I get that basic idea, but yeah, once you're going that fast, it's more, maybe you're more circles and then you are like full ranges. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think like by the time that foot hits the floor at that speed, I think, the brain, the nervous system, it's got a strategy in place, and it's not caring about turning a muscle on. It's caring about not falling over, as you said, managing forces really. So, or it's trying to, survival or beat the guy next to him or whatever it is, instinctively. So it's it's interesting that.
So when you use the Squish the Orange, I think it's is it basically like in the bridge? This is just how I understand it. So just maybe to explain for listeners or confirm, like my understanding would be in like when you're on your back in that bridge, you're only lifting your butt or hip off the ground like an inch or something, instead of the typical is just lifted all the way up, which creates an impingement strategy basically for a lot of people. So you're leaving your butt down and your foot's on the ground, but you're kind of like pushing the arch of your foot into the ground. Well, it's not really.
Yeah. So you just have no intent through your heel basically. So you're putting a plantar flexion force, and then you're basically just get off your heel. That's probably the easiest thing. And then we don't want the bum to come too far up, because if the bum starts coming up, you're going to use your back a little bit as well. So by keeping the bum just off the floor, it's going to put all the tension in the leg basically. So it's the same kind of concept as the slouch, but just in lying on your back. So the lower we keep the bum, the more the leg's going to have to do the work. The higher the bum is, the back's going to get involved, so that's kind of the reasoning there. And with those kind of exercises, again, I've got nothing against glute bridges and going through full range, but if I want somebody, so again, I do these variations, is when they do a glute bridge on the way down, I'll actually get them to dorsiflex. And then I'll actually, so on the way down from a glute bridge, all the weight's on their heel. and then I'll get them to smack their actual, like, forcefully plantar flex their foot into the floor and have to build tension to get back up again. And a lot of it's interesting when you do that with athletes, because it's the timing of that slap and to build that tension through soleus, through hamstrings, and then drive through the hip. Some athletes struggle with that.
Yeah.
So I'm not against the heel, but I just think the heel on the way down.
Yeah, I like, because I like that you said that. I tend to get in, I don't know what you call it, like I tend to polarize things a little bit, and because it's almost like if the industry was so into everything through the heel, then it's easy to just go the other way and say, well, everything's floating heels now, because clearly through the heel wasn't very good for expressing power through the foot. But I like how I've heard David say this a lot, using the whole foot, using it all the way from the heel all the way to the ball of the foot. And so it makes sense to me. And what I was going to ask you this, because Brett Contreras has been on the show a couple times, and I actually would be curious what he thinks about this, as he had said somewhere that in a basically like a glute bridge or a single leg glute bridge, I don't remember what, it was some version of the hip thrust. And he said, I think 2/3 of the population got a greater glute, like EMG or whatever output when their heels were on the ground. And like 1/3 got more actually when they put their balls of the feet down and did it. And so, I mean, I guess that doesn't say what's optimal. I guess what I'm saying is, I guess those people who got more when they put the balls of the feet down, that would probably be the optimal situation, wouldn't you say? I mean, I felt like that's what I felt I noticed when I watched athletes do it, and whatever they felt came naturally, at least.
It's interesting that, because I think that study in itself, I'm not saying it's flawed, but from my experience, a lot of people, if they can't tolerate the load through the hamstring or the midfoot, they're not going to, because what has to happen when you push through the midfoot, you want that hamstring to work like almost isometrically. So if they're not good at working isometrically, they're not going to access the hip as much. So I think a lot of those people, I could be completely wrong, but I think a lot of those people that got more through the heel, if they'd done the midfoot bridge, I would be very confident the majority of them would cramp in the hamstring and the soleus. So they're not good at transferring energy, would be my gut instinct on that. And that's completely my opinion from just treating a lot of athletes. So, that would be my thoughts on that, without, being too dismissive of that study. Whereas I think with the heel, you don't have that, because if you push through the midfoot, there's a nervous system component there of threat to the soleus, of developing high levels of tension, and the hamstring that they're not used to. So then it's like, it's not about a hip thrust, it's about, managing that shit. Like, my soleus is going to cramp, or I'm not going to develop that much tension. So I wouldn't want to talk about the glute until you can really develop high levels of tension through the hamstring and work it isometrically. And I think when you get that, that's when you can tap into the glute. Because even at the top of an Olympic, not an Olympic lift, like an RDL or a deadlift, if you build tension well through your midfoot and forefoot, your proximal glutes will be absolutely screaming, because you don't have to squeeze your glute, because everything's working well, and you're working everything isometrically in terms of hamstring and soleus there as well, and your glutes engaged, because you can build, like Cal Dietz, I think you had him on the show, didn't you?
Yeah. Like,
he talks about building tension through the big toe. Like, his stuff fits perfect with my kind of biases in that side of it as well, because it's more about the connection, in my opinion, in my head, between the soleus and the hamstring to allow you to tap into the glute. So for me, I wouldn't have a conversation about glute activation until we knew, can they actually tolerate hamstring and soleus, which I appreciate is different to obviously Brett's stuff and the hip thrust, which is absolutely fine.
Yeah, when I first started using hip thrusts with my sprint population like 10 years ago, people were running faster and maintaining it better. But I kind of almost, and then I used it, for years after that with college sprinters, we got good results. But it's funny because the last few years, I've kind of gotten away from it and gotten in actually more of the bridges and slouches, and just from the thought of, well, if I can get the glutes and soleus to activate like the way it should, and then just do all the other stuff, Olympic lifts and various squats. Like, ideally, it's just that the pattern's right, and then you can do whatever, and it'll be better. Versus, I don't know. That's just where I went. But my thought would be, if I was to do the hip thrust again, which I'd be happy to with those athletes. I mean, I think most coaches just put the feet on the ground and just don't really coach anything. They just say get the bar from point A to point B. But if you were going to coach that lift, I guess with trying to prioritize, you would say at heels on the way down, like midfoot on the way up for the most part then?
Yeah, definitely. And like I had this with an S&C coach who we were doing, like, I was doing group sessions with him, and I just showed him some of this stuff. And what you'll usually feel when you do that for the first time is you'll feel a lot of tension in your hamstrings. So when you're doing a bridge, you're like, oh, I can really feel my hamstrings here. But as I said, the more efficient you get with that, the hamstrings will start to tolerate that load better. Then you'll really feel the glutes. So you're not really going to feel the glutes in a hip thrust when you start pushing through the midfoot. From my experience clinically, you're not going to see that probably for a few weeks until the hamstrings get used to tolerating the load. Then you'll really feel the glute. But saying that, in rugby league, I actually coach them to bridge pushing through the heel as well sometimes, because that's specific. Like a lot of them, someone will be on their backs, and the position they'll be in, they'll be in that position where the heel is close to the bum. So they really have to dig through the heel and almost thrust up. But when they do that kind of bridge, their intent, it happens a lot through the hip. So they're trying to get the guy off them, like almost like wrestling. And they're thrusting through the heels, but they're also thrusting through the hips at the same time. So there's times to obviously coach a bridge through the heel as well. I think it kind of goes back to the start. It's understanding why you're doing things, what you're trying to achieve with the rehab exercise. I think is kind of paramount, really.
This is the thing where rehab, though, I think flows into performance so well, just because I look back at my results with the hip thrust back when I was coaching these sprinters, and it seemed like, honestly, it was just the introduction of the exercise, not even going heavy with it, but just doing it and almost letting athletes experience it. And I wasn't coaching the feet. I was just letting them do whatever. And it was almost just like that novel experience without that chain of muscles seemed to offer the improvement. But it didn't seem like going from like 300 to 400 pounds helped anyone. You know what I'm saying? Like, and maybe if you didn't have a good pattern, or the pattern you have to pick up to go from 300 to 400 to 500 isn't beneficial anymore. If it's bilateral, maybe you're arching your back a little bit to do it, and you're just not activating things in the pattern that they would, the co-contraction pattern that they would see. It almost strikes me that, I don't know, like a progression that's perhaps more single leg in nature and more revolving around some of the things that you're talking about. If we're going to load it, of course, then I just say, just sprint and just bound and just do these things at some point. You got the activation, so let's go now. I don't know. I'm just curious. I mean, it's an interesting thought process.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, I still think that like there's a massive place for like hip thrust and stuff like that. It's, for me, it all goes back. Have they got the ability to develop tension? I think that that's the first prerequisite really that we want them to have, because as I said, you can see guys and they'll deadlift and they'll knee valgus, to maybe use their adductor magnus to hip extend more, which is fine. And when you get up into the max lifts, you hit the nail on the head there. And that's probably with Brett's work as well. When you're hip thrusting, it's not really about perfect technique. It's just like get the thing up as quickly as you can. And if I don't like tolerating load through my soleus and hamstring, I'm definitely going to use my heel to get up there. So that's going to feel more efficient for me at the moment with my previous injuries, with my experiences, with how my nervous system is set up. So yeah, I think for me it all comes back to ideally, like in the weight room, how we can keep the tension, as you said, is just use the full foot. So heel on the way, like hip flexion, hip extension, midfoot, forefoot. If you kind of keep those principles, it's, you're challenging the base of support as well, which is awesome, because then you're going to get the preflexes, the reflexes interested as well. And that's kind of where Bosch's stuff fits in nicely as well then.
Yeah, maybe we can just, a couple more questions and kind of get there. We've been talking about like a lot of the rudimentary, these are the basic patterns. And also, just before we maybe leave off this, so with the midfoot and like, we talked about that in the back, but like in a split squat position then, the slouch, or even just maybe just for just ease of just mentioning it, like let's say we're just doing a split squat and the knees coming over the toe. It's kind of like heel on the way down, but then on the way back up, you're pushing through the middle of the foot, like squishing an orange on the way back up.
Yeah, and it completely depends if you want more vertical or horizontal force production, So like when you get onto your midfoot, you have to lean forward slightly, so that's going to help you get, because the glute's going to want to go forward, whereas if you go straight up, the knee's going to want to snap back. So the knee joint's going to do more work. So it just completely depends what you want to do. So for example, with those split squat slouches, I had a guy with a PCL tear. We were in Denver actually with a rehab. We were playing a mid-season tour, and he done his PCL the day before we flew. Came over late, and it was like he came over with a PCL tear. So I was like, oh my god! So this was interesting. So I just spent the week rehabbing him. He got a week's holiday in Denver, which was good for him. But he was doing the slouches, and his knee kept bending, and I was like, I was going to correct him, and I was like, actually, I want this because I want the quads to do more work because it's a PCL. So I was like, yeah, keep bending the knee. I was like, right, bend the knee a little bit more. He's going, shit, I can really feel my quads there. I'm like, fucking perfect. It's a PCL tear. Whereas if that was an ACL, I definitely wouldn't want that. I'd want the other, So it just goes back to, understanding what you want to achieve. And if you want to put more load through the quad, push through the heel. If you don't want the soleus to do as much, or the hamstrings.
It's interesting, to equate that to a PCL and the forces in the front versus the back. Even though I don't really work with athletes in that situation, I don't even remember having in my roles, but it's good to know, because I guess it's nice to know that, hey, the heel could be for this in this situation if you were going to use it, just before you tell everybody to not do that. And I guess, maybe the split squat wasn't a good example, because like you said, if you're doing a split squat, the weight is going to be over the front heel, because that's where your rib cage is. It's all in back of you. So to get through the midfoot, something's got to be forward over the knee, and that's like running.
Yeah.
Something's coming over the knee, or something's coming over the foot, your whole body in running, or even jumping at some point. So
exactly. If you want to use a split squat, you want to get overload, or you want to put load through tissues, that's absolutely fine. I think if you want to coordinate, and that's where kind of you cross the line into coordination, so that would be like a coordination split squat, where your base of support's a lot shorter, and as they come up, they're going through, so they're going forward as opposed to up. Then I think that's more of a, and I think that's kind of where Cal Dietz's stuff, you see he's very innovative in a lot of his stuff, but his planks and his sprinter planks and stuff like that, So I think he's great for stuff like that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in moving, so we got the, on the back bridges, we're doing the slouches and the split stance and just trying to get that midfoot. So once an athlete can do that and then things are adequate there, when are they done with that? When it's okay, we can move past this and let's get to some more advanced things.
Great questions. That goes back to coordination for me. So in my mind, coordination is this big, if you had coordination on a graph, you'd see a lot of squiggles and then you'd see smoothing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So that to me is when they first start the exercise, they're almost quivering, their muscles are shaking, they're a little bit rigid, they're struggling with the exercise. When they get to them where they can do what I would call Louis Gifford's thoughtless fearless movement, where they're doing it very fast and it's effortless, or it's too easy from them, move them on. So, the second they could do that and it's not challenging them, get them up to the next level.
Yeah, that's just what, not even just in rehab, I've been talking about that concept on this show some of the last few episodes, just even the context of plyometrics. Why do we hang around single leg hop and sticks forever? It's this plyometric doctrine that we all must come back to. Once an athlete's good at this, why aren't we going forward and continuing to challenge the system? So it's good to hear you say that. I just feel like it 100%. Can go everywhere.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, Joel, I don't think, my honest opinion, which is why, I built out the mentorship. Most people in my mentorship, they need modules 7 to 12, and that is bridging the gap from the low level to the high level. And that's where we can't have squash and orange, and you're going to have less core contractions because there's going to be chaos. And that's where the Gary Gray stuff fits in nicely, is that's where we need to be with people. And I always said on the coaching calls, that's what builds confidence. When they can manage a perturbation, you've got an MCL tear and their knee is valgus, and they stick that landing and their medial gastro and hamstring kicks in and they're stable. It's fuck, I can do this now again. That's so important. I know you talk about the mental aspect of injury. It's so important to build confidence, because what I've seen in professional sport, and I don't want to kind of get too ahead of the conversation, but you can get someone out of pain, but they can go back and perform like crap. Or you can get somebody right and they're just brimming with confidence. And I want my athletes to say, I'm ready to go back. And I've had this recently. We fucked up, again, where we're rushing a guy back and clinically he looks fine, but he's saying, oh, it feels a bit early, and then they go back and they break down again. And it's shit, fucked up, you know what I mean? And that's where he didn't have thoughtless, fearless movement. And that to me is just you fucking idiot. Sorry, I'm swearing, I'm talking about myself. Not listening to the alley. I broke one of my rules, So that's really interesting. And that's where, what you said, our continuous bounds, if you've got a hamstring tear and he can continuous bound 20, 30 meters on one leg, balls out, he's coming off that session, he's buzzing because he's got confidence in that leg again, but he's not going to get that confidence on his back doing a midfoot bridge. or, doing a hop and stick. It's just not high level enough from the rate of force development and all that stuff. So that's the value to me in the high level stuff is where we don't spend enough time. We rush it. Some of the clubs I work with now, it's funny because when I go into a club, I have to convince them of this stuff. And the first thing they want to do is they want to run them. So, the minute they can run, they're out in the pitch and they're doing low level running, and they're doing like running at 40-50% of their max speed. And it's like they should be. And I'm like, get them in the gym and work them up and get the bounds done, because that's the bit that's going to create the resilience. You're not getting anything from this. We're getting a little bit of running, but they're usually going to break down with the high speed running, but you can't get them to high speed running. And then when we try pushing to the high speed running, they feel symptoms again because we skip steps. And I see that time and time again. So if we can really build that resilience, as you said there, like the continuous bounce, to me, that's the pre-step to high speed running. If you can do that, then I can take the emotion out of it. And I go, logically, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do high speed running now if you can do that stuff for me. And of course, we need to build them up at the graded exposure with tempos and stuff like that, and not go from 0 to 100. But what you've done there is you've taken the emotion out. The athlete is confident and he's going, right, I'm ready to run fast now. And I just think that's absolutely, it's so important to have that. And anytime I haven't had that with Natalie and I put him back, it's come back to burn me in the ass.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing as in working in with someone in your job, your shoes, compared to like a coach. It's like, for you, it's very black and white. You put an athlete in, and did they get hurt or didn't they? And if they did, it's just like, I mean, we're in coaching position. It's like, all right, we're going to get to the big meet. Hopefully they do well. If the athlete doesn't do well, it's like, well, it could have been this. You can like, I don't know. Like, it's just different. That's a stressful thing, man. But
there's nowhere to hide. And
yeah.
That's the thing. Like in professional sport, there's nowhere to hide. There's consequences for your actions. I'm not a Twitter guru or a Facebook guru who's saying ideals. That's the big thing, is like this shit. It's like, it's real life, and what people are saying on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, it sounds great, but actually the reality is very, very different. And it's like, oh, do your Nordics or do this or do that, and it's like, they're going to be fine. It's like, it's like consultants, surgeons, they absolutely drive me crazy. It's like, yeah, he'll be ready in 2 weeks to go back. You're looking at him going, and then he can't even hop yet, and you're saying like he's going to be back in 2 weeks. It's like, they don't have a clue. So real life is very, very different to the ideal life.
Yeah, I agree with that one. I mean, yeah, especially when it's like the high pressure, high level, keeping athletes healthy. I mean, that's and it forces you to, as you've done your work, to get better, to learn more, to cover your bases. And versus, I think it's easier to hide in, I mean, not completely, but if it's just a performance outcome, sometimes I think it's a little bit easier to potentially hide and say different things could contribute to what, and you have natural talent, predispositions, and stuff like that. So it definitely forces
definitely. I think the more we can take the emotion out of decision making, the better in my kind of role. And I think that's where the system is good, where if we can tick these boxes, at least we know we've done it, and logically, he's tolerated ground reaction forces, he's producing the same rate of force development. Logically, he should be able to high speed run now and tolerate that. And I think if we can take the emotion out of decision making, it's so powerful. And that's where the system is. I think it's been great for me, where, as I said, I mess up less these days. I continue to mess up, and I continue to push guys too hard because that's my job. But it's getting the balance with that, really. But I'd like to think I mess up less and less because of the system, really.
You mentioned Gary Gray, and like, because in getting past the rudimentary, like, okay, squish the orange, it's not novel anymore. And Bobby Stroop, who's been on the show recently a few times, I know learned a lot from Gary Gray. I'm not actually that familiar with the system. The one thing that comes to mind, I guess, is just talking about drivers, like, using drivers and swinging limbs as perturbations. That's about as far as I get or know, but I'd be curious as to how you escalate the intensity with that type of methods once an athlete's past the squish the orange and the co-contractions.
Yeah, so there's a really good paper in 2014. I think it was a guy called, surname was Pryor et al. 2014. I think it was the muscle activations of the trunk and hip, or the muscle activation of the hip in response to the trunk movement or something. I can send you the paper again, but that kind of justified what Gary Gray was saying for a long time. So it was great to have that kind of evidence, because he's been talking about this stuff for a long, long time. His stuff, again, with the utmost respect, I thought when I went through a lot of his stuff, I was like, I thought he complicated a lot of it, using a lot of words, that I was just lost with. And it was a bit like just do a lot of this stuff, do a lot of that. What I've tried to do is take the structure. So by the time we get onto kind of some of those drivers and those perturbations, they already have a co-contraction. They've already got a high level of load tolerance through the hamstring and soleus or the lateral hip or whatever it is. So then when I get to his kind of type of movement, I'm very confident that they're ready for that. So his stuff in my system is probably 4 or 5 steps in, if that makes sense. But that's great then where, and this is where when I do the leaps and stuff, it all comes together, because I want them to leap and land on the midfoot. You know, whether the heel hits the floor first or the toes, I don't care once you get back on the midfoot, because that's where you're going to, you know, have movement options for the next step.
Oh,
then.
yeah.
So then, you know, I'll take a leap and then I'll use a hand driver or something like that. So as the foot hits the floor, you know, a right foot leap, I can get you to reach your right hand to the left across your body to send your pelvis laterally so that we can put a bit more load through your lateral hip. If I want to put more load through soleus and the knee, I can reach up to the ceiling, which is going to shorten the length tension relationship of the glute, and I'll have more load going through the soleus and the quad. If I want more through the hip as you leap, I can reach forward and send the hip back and then put that in a better length tension relationship. So it's all kind of just length tension relationships and stuff like that. But I use a very simplified version of kind of those drivers now to create chaos and to perturbate challenge the base of support. And I think that to me fits nicely with the thoughtless, fearless movement, because that, you know, by the time the foot hits the floor, you want to be reaching or do your hand driver at the exact same time as your foot hits the floor. Because if you do it, if your foot lands and then you do the driver, it's too controlled. Whereas we want to create that chaos. So that's where you can create a perturbation, and then you have to, that's a lot of that's outside of conscious control then. You know, that's all like spinal cord and peripheral tissues at that level, which is great, because that then we're starting to bridge the gap to thoughtless, fearless movement. So yeah, so just took his stuff, then started to increase the speed of movement. So I go leap, I go hop off stick, continuous hops, which is kind of like your single leg bounds. And then when they've nailed all of that, then they're ready to run. But what I'll do a lot is like an ACL. I'll use that knowledge from Gary Gray's stuff, and I might have somebody with their hands overhead with a plate, side flex them to the left, which will mean that it's a lot harder to use their lateral hip. So they'll have to use their medial hamstring a lot more, and I'll get them to continuous bound in that position. So we have to put a lot more load through their medial hamstring. So that's an ACL guide that I had. And that was the exact mechanism that he had. And I know a lot of groin pain patients, actually, that's the position that they get in when they get pain, because they overload the groin. So with a groin pain patient, I might do the opposite reach to put more load through their lateral hip. So I might get them to reach to the right and do a single leg bound. So I'm putting more load through their lateral hip. So all of that, to me, understanding the way we're doing things, it just comes back to length tension relationships. You can put muscles in positions where they're shortened, which makes it really hard for them to do work. So other muscles are going to have to figure it out. And that's the beauty of the nervous system, is that something will do its job or figure out how to do it. So the thorax stuff and putting the rib cage in certain positions, I think that, you know, it's genius in a way, because that gives me a regression, a progression, or, you know, some kind of middle point where if an athlete struggles with a movement, I can still get them to hop, but I can just dictate where the load goes. And that's really useful as well in acute stage with sports injuries.
Yeah, as you're talking about all that, and again, it's a lot that you just mentioned, but it is simple at its core. It's simple. Its hands are ahead, they're at the side, and I think about that too. You almost gave me like I would call like the track and field, like high, not just return to play, but high performance grade. And if I'm doing bounding for max bound distance, there's different ways you'll see people use their arms in triple jump, or you'll see people use their arms in spirals, or I've done bounding where I make my hands go out wide, not for return to play, just to try to bound better, like out wide to in intentionally, like those types of. And you watch different athletes and they have different strategies. But to me, as I'm thinking about what you said, it would make sense to try to expose athletes to all ways you could use your arms for this bound. And even for running, like I've really gone to just liking, instead of trying to confuse things, just and I confuse myself plenty, but just like running with David Weck was on the show a couple times. He's got a pulsar, like a weight, a shaking hand weight that you can run, and you can put it in one hand, you can put it in the other hand. Like I like using the Exogen, like little mini weights that you can put on sleeves and just like loading one side or the other. And to me, that's so much more enjoyable to try to work with versus, I don't know, just overloading with cues sometimes. Just like give the athlete a driver in a high speed situation and see how they manage it. And
yeah,
that's where the real learning. Yeah.
Yeah, and like that's the best athletes. Like they're just great problem solvers. You just give them a movement problem and they get it like that. They figure out a way. And that goes back to kind of Bosch's self-organizing. The nervous, it'll just self-organize and figure out ways and it'll learn, and that's, as you said, they're like the best athletes. They love that stuff and it pisses them off when they can't get it, because they get frustrated. But yeah, I mean, like golfers, especially, they're really good because they're so in tune with their bodies as well that some of the golfers I've worked with, when you give them those kind of movement problems, they do really well with them.
Yeah,
whereas rugby players are probably the other end of the spectrum. They're not very body aware.
Yeah, maybe they need to play golf in their off season or something like that.
Yeah. They wouldn't have much rib cage mobility for that.
Very short and abbreviated swings.
Yeah.
So awesome. Actually, just one last thing. I did. Maybe we'll just cap it with just the foot today because it was a good foot and hip, good topic. But one thing I wanted to mention too, you coach midfoot just because, like, if you said balls of the feet, because a lot of people will coach balls of the feet or whatever, but that could shove people into their toes too fast. Is that or it keeps
more so it's where your laces are on your trainers.
Yeah.
So the laces down to the toes. But again, like you can play with that because if I wanted to get more FHL, I might coach you to push through the pad of your big toe. So not the ball of your big toe, but the actual pad of it. So if you push through the pad of your big toe, you're going to get a massive supination of the calcaneus there because that's going to get your FHL, which will pull you into supination. So like I've had Achilles ruptures where I've really focused on using a top-down cue, coaching the pad of the big toe. So it's not just midfoot, it goes back to understanding what you're trying to load more, and we can bias the FHL, we can get a little bit more tib post. If I wanted more perennials, I'll probably go right push through the ball of your big toe a bit more, something like that. So I think we need soleus on, or we need not on, but we need a lot more high levels of tension through it, and then you can also play a little bit with whether you want a little bit more force on the lateral shin or the medial shin or whatever you want to do as well.
Interesting. That you said FHL or flexus hallucis longus. That makes me think of Joe DeFranco used to talk about that. He had his toe training exercises. I am curious about that. So I think about I tend to polarize stuff. If I'm like, it's like, okay, don't grip the toes. I'm like, okay, I'm going to make everything about, if I have my hand here in front of me, I just make everything about the pad of the hand and I let the toes organize themselves. I just say, don't grip, but the big toe is kind of because you'll get coaches saying, oh, get to the big toe, push off the big toe. But the big toe isn't strong enough to really push off of. I don't know. Could you explain maybe some dynamics of when to actually get it? Like when should I be coaching an athlete to at least like tap through that pad of the big toe, and when do they need more flexor or FHL strength?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I probably like unless it was like an Achilles or like so he was an Achilles rupture repair. So like when his knee to wall. He was doing his knee to wall and he was like, he got a lot of protective tone in the back under his Achilles. So, his big toe was stiff. So I was trying to influence his FHL. So in that scenario, I think, I definitely want to cue the pad of big toe. But I'd be honest, I wouldn't be going out to, with an athlete and going, I'm going to strengthen your FHL today. I think so like one of the exercises we do is the slouch. But then instead of coming back up, we'll explode onto a box. So I don't know if you've seen that variation.
No, I haven't.
So it's a bit like, Bosch's stuff where you'll do like an RDL up onto a box. So we'll slouch. And then what I'll do is I'll put the box maybe 5 meters in front of you. And I'll say, stay in a tunnel. And I want you to keep slouch, keep your head relaxed. And I want you to push off that foot. So that we'll slouch them onto the midfoot. And to push off then in the tunnel onto a box, they have to generate a lot of tension there. So they'll find their big toe, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier, they'll find a way to be explosive to get on that. So that's probably, if I thought you had a turf toe, which we see a lot of them in rugby, and, the first met, they're avoiding loading that, I might do some hands-on around the capsule, try free up the big toe joint. Then I might put them into that position where they have to really push off the big toe. So the intermediate step might be a pad of big toe, get a little bit of just show the brain it's safe, but then put them into that explosive position and show them how to do that. So I think, to go back to your question, I think if it was a genuine, like if there was pathology or I felt like FHL was involved, then I might do that. But for most people, generically, push out, squashing oranges is probably going to be good enough. And then just, as I said, put them on a box, go right, leap onto that box or explode onto that box. They'll have to find a big toe to generate force. but there's a lot of stuff that happens before they find a big toe, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes good sense, and helps to, again, it's never one or the other. It's nice to know when that is needed and necessary. Before we get out of here, Dave, you would you mind sharing? I know, like you said, you're not big on social media, but if people are interested in like your mentorship or what you do, where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, if you click on my website, you'll probably see me all over social media. So you'll think, what's the other? He's not big on social media. But no, we've got a team now that does the marketing. I'm not big and personally going on social media anymore. I try to stay off it if I can. But you can head over to thegotofysio.com, www.thegotofysio.com, or like I think if you search my name, I think it's Dave O'Sullivan on Instagram, Dave O'Sullivan Physio. I might come up on that. We've got some more content. We're going to put out some more actual clinical content in the next few months as well. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm happy to share about anything you want. If you want the slouch videos and stuff, you can embed them or do whatever you want with them. And yeah, that's it. Or my email's dave@thegotofysio.com if you want to email me on that. And yeah, just check out that stuff. And obviously, yeah, we've got a mentorship. So, as I said, it's just a combination of building up a system for people. Take all the good stuff from my system and take all the good stuff from your system, and you build your system. I'm not trying to, I always say it, like David Gray is a great example of that. I'm not trying to create clones of myself. You have to do it this way. Take the stuff and make it work for you, because your population, Joe, is very different to mine. It's very different to the person working in national healthcare. So it's all about, getting a system that works for you in your population. I think it's very important.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Dave. I appreciate having you on, man.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to be on. I love what you're doing with the site. So it's a privilege to be on with some other great speakers.
Thanks for listening to another show. If you enjoyed it, you could help us out by leaving us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. We'd really appreciate it. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest. Have a good one.